Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along. And particular thanks to my colleague, Hannah, for jumping on this opportunity that Peter has given us to run this event. And great thanks to Peter. Peter used to work for Cornwall Council. And for those of you in the council business, Cornwall has been quite a pioneer in a number of very interesting aspects of policy and action around everything from renewables to carbon management and all the rest of it. So I'm sure we can drag some of that experience out of him as well as we go through. And looking forward to the event very much indeed. Thanks again for our panel members too for your time this afternoon. I think that's all I'll say, Peter, and then we'll gallop on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. So yes, I'm going to start us off with a bit of a presentation about the outcomes of COP. So we'll start quite broad and then get narrower and narrower, more specifically into the Cotswold District as the event goes on. A bit of context to this. So my role at the University of Exeter is setting up a new project called the Green Futures Network, which is a network that's due to launch early next year. And the purpose of this is to increase the access for communities, businesses, local authorities to the environmental and climate research and resources that the University of Exeter are developing. There's a lot of some really useful and interesting stuff there, but sometimes it's quite impenetrable, needs a bit of translation and needs to be made more available to people who can use this work on the ground. So that's the context of me offering to do this event and talk about the experience of Exeter University at COP26. So I'm going to share my screen. I'll talk for about 20 minutes. I'd really welcome any comments, questions. I won't be able to see them as I'm going, but please do put them in the chat. And then we'll have time for a little Q&A if there's any questions or anyone else wants to share any other insights about their perspective on COP before we move on to the panel discussion. So this is what I'm going to talk about, COP26, the Conference of Parties, the 26th iteration of that. But I'm also going to talk about the net zero strategy that the UK government released in October, which is effectively the UK's formal response to COP, the formal submission. And this was our first national plan as to how the UK government is going to meet its ambitions, its targets to halve emissions by 2030 and eliminate them by 2050. So a significant document that is that I will touch on as well alongside the outcomes of COP. Now, what were the outcomes of COP? There are a few things that are worth touching on. One of those was this phrase of keeping 1.5 alive. This might be something that you have heard said, heard repeated, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail, but it's just effectively this idea of keeping the possibility of reaching a 1.5 degree warming target, keeping that possible. I'll touch on that more in a bit. The second important thing is one of the reasons that COP26 was so significant and there was so much attention on it was not just that it was in the UK, in our backyard, but also that it was the first COP since Paris in 2015, where countries were expected to submit their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which is effectively their commitments to how they are going to reduce their emissions, what their targets are going to be, how they're going to achieve those targets. And the plan was to do that every 5 years, but at Glasgow, having submitted those and seen that they weren't getting us to that 1.5 degree target, there's a new a request, not a commitment, a request for countries to submit again next year. So to do it more on an annual basis rather than every 5 years. So what that means in practice is that we're going to hear a lot more in the next 12 months about this 1.5 degree target, how we're going to reach that. There's going to be more details. Not every country is going to respond to that request, but it's significant that it's out there. And then thirdly, there were quite a few pledges, which you might have read about, around methane, around deforestation, coal, climate finance. I'm not going to talk about those in any detail. I'll share some further reading about them in the follow-up email, partly because they don't have a huge impact at a local level, and partly because they are just pledges, they're not actions. So only time will tell what happens as a result of those. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the key points I think it's really useful to focus on and build on that have come out of COP26. So some of the outcomes, but also the trends that we're starting to see. So one of them is this idea of 1.5 degrees. So again, it's probably a number that you've heard a lot and are familiar with. This graph is a really helpful one by the excellent Carbon Brief. Again, I'll share a link to this afterwards. And what this is effectively showing us is how, if you add together all of the commitments that the countries around the world have made, this is the level of warming they are expecting to reach. So starting in 2020, then looking at before COP this year, at COP this year, and then on the right-hand side, the bluer ones, looking at not just the commitments they've made, but also the net zero promises. And what this graph is effectively telling us is that the most optimistic scenario we have at the moment, based on what countries have said they're going to do, is a 1.8 degree period of warming. And there's a couple of things to note on this. One is that 1.5 is not a safety net. It's not really a target. We're at 1.1, 1.2 at the moment, and we're already seeing significant impacts in this country, but much more so around the world as well. See what's happening in British Columbia at the moment and other parts of the world. So 1.5 doesn't mean that's exactly where we should aim, and if we hit that, we're okay. There is going to be significant impact to that. So 1.8, every fraction of a degree between 1.5 and 1.8 does have consequences with it. So it's really important that we do analyze these numbers. We don't just kind of take them for granted and assume that they mean a kind of a level of safety and a consistency. The other important thing about 1.5 that requires a bit of scrutiny is that there's a lot of uncertainty within this. This is the best data and the best science that we have, but it's not an exact science. These are predictions, these are models. So as you can see here, the smaller numbers under the larger temperatures indicate the range of uncertainty. So even the 1.8 degree most best case scenario at the moment, it could be anywhere from 1.5 degrees right up to 2.4. So the reason I share this is we are going to hear a lot more about 1.5. This number is going to be used a lot more as shorthand and as a target. And it's really important that at a local level, we do constantly check in with that. And what does that really mean? What's going on there? Okay, so next up, I want to talk about the bigger picture around COP, because I think to analyze what happened at this COP, it's useful to look back and think, well, what's happened since previous COPs? Because the impact, the change that the conference can bring isn't instantaneous. The world doesn't suddenly change around it. But it's really useful to reflect back on how far we've come and how these conferences do shift the conversation. So thinking again back to Paris, which is one of the most famous in terms of people having heard of it, what has happened since then? There's been a lot. So we've seen a real innovation in clean technology, political resilience for governments and local governments responding to the climate emergency. We've really seen the normalization of this 1.5 degree idea, the normalization of net zero. These were not ideas and terminologies that were that common before that point. We've seen a real shift towards clean energy and significant institutional change at governmental level, at business level, across the world. And obviously not all of these things can be attributed to, well, that happened because of COP, but it's important to note how far we have come, because sometimes it's very easy to overlook these things and miss them. Another really significant thing to notice is how the science is more increasingly accepted. So here we just look back 3 years ago to 2018 and COP24, where there was a real push by a number of countries to keep the IPCC's 1.5 degree report out of the official COP documentation. Whereas now in Glasgow, it was front and center in the Glasgow report. And this is echoed in many of the conversations I had with the scientists we had up at COP26. There's a much stronger acceptance of the science around climate change and the climate emergency, which is really positive and significant. Lastly, on a bigger picture, fossil fuels. Here are some quotations about coal. Jennifer Morgan says the era of coal is ending. The UK government's own press release says the end of coal is in sight. And we're really seeing a shift in the language around fossil fuels being described as toxic assets. So particularly coal, but fossil fuels more generally. And obviously there's a huge gap between people saying these words and these things actually happening. And there's a lot more we need to do. But this is significant, and this does need to be taken into account. The fact that this language is new and being said by people who haven't said these things before. So next up, I want to talk about behavioural trends. So these are things we're really noticing in UK government and the UK more generally that I think have a real resonance at a local level. And there's two examples I want to talk about. Firstly, behaviour change. So when you examine the language that UK government is using around the net zero strategy and around COP26, these are the kind of things that are being said. So saying we want to go with the grain of existing behaviour and trends. Expecting the British public to forego holidays abroad would be an enormous political challenge. So what we're really seeing here is a delegation of responsibility around behaviour change. The UK government doesn't really want to engage in encouraging people to shift to more low carbon behaviours. But we know that this stuff is going to have to happen. If we are to reach our targets, if we are to hit where we need to be, this has to happen. So currently the responsibility for this behaviour change is falling on local authorities, on local businesses, on community groups. And this is something we are going to have to do a lot more work on. And it's complex. This is not an easy thing. We look at this is a survey done recently asking people about what would they be willing to do to hear the languages, preserve the planet, which we could have a whole nother discussion about what that means. So 46% of people here say, I don't think I really need to change my habits. Obviously that's less than 50%, but still a lot of people who think that they don't need to do anything. There's more people saying that they need more financial support, guidance, resources in order to take action. And the largest group, 76% of people saying that they would accept stricter rules and environmental regulations. And here we get into a bit of a catch-22 because this is the kind of behaviour change that people are leaning towards most, the sort of behaviour change that is put on us by government. But this is equally the kind of behaviour change that UK government is saying it doesn't really want to do at the moment. So there's a gap here, and this needs to be covered somewhere. And obviously, local councils, local organisations, community groups don't have the power to do these, but it's really important to think about, well, how do these impact us? What role can we play in that shift towards behaviour change so that when we're ready for new policies to come in, those are accepted? And secondly, I think it's important to look at the global framing as well. And basically what I mean by this is, who can we blame for the climate emergency? Do we blame China? Do we blame India? We're seeing a lot of language around nationally apportioned blame. So looking at some of the headlines that have come out of around COP26, The Sun talking about blaming China, Russia and India, The Guardian quoting Alok Sharma, effectively blaming India and China. And there's a lot of language around this, and it's deeply unhelpful, but also it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. There's a lot of barriers facing countries very, very differently in terms of how they respond to the climate emergency. India, for example, is not only looking towards its climate targets, it's having to deal with crippling poverty. China, we export many of our emissions over to China in terms of that's where a lot of the things we buy and use are made. These things don't neatly get broken down across governmental national borders. We could also look at corporations and their impact on the climate emergency, and they don't neatly fit into national categories either. So this kind of language is unhelpful and it doesn't really make much sense. But it's not new. This is a cartoon from 2015 after the climate summit, effectively blaming India for disrupting the targets of COP15. And this effectively boils down to subtle and not so subtle forms of racism. These are messages that are being used to shift blame onto other people. And as the climate emergency has a stronger and stronger impact locally, we really need to watch out for these kind of messages as well. Where is blame being apportioned? Are we playing into any of those messaging? And this poses a significant communication challenge for us at a local level as well. So next up, I want to talk about climate adaptation. So this is something that didn't really feature very much at COP26. There was more than there has been previously, but previously there's been very, very little. And what talk about climate adaptation there was mostly focused at countries in the global south, where there are more significant or more noticeable impacts being felt. And for good reason, for trying to support countries who maybe don't have the resources to adapt as quickly as we might be able to. But the key thing with climate adaptation is that our ability to understand and predict the impact of climate change locally is far outpacing the local strategies and policies we have in place to address and reduce that impact. So while focusing on mitigation is really important, we need to reduce our impact. We also need to adapt and put more resource into adaptation. I've just taken, for example, this is a map showing the future risk of surface level flooding. So I've just looked at Cirencester, so you can kind of see the blues. The darker blues is where there's going to be more surface level flooding, and the lighter blues less. So this map doesn't tell us a huge amount of detail, but it's an example of we have this information. We don't necessarily know exactly yet what that's going to mean, but that's where local insight and local ideas can really fill in those stories. When you show people these maps, most people go straight to, oh, where's my house? Is my house affected? Which is, a very common reaction. But actually, it's really important to look at, well, is my electricity impacted? Can I still get to hospital? Can I still get to work? And really looking at, well, how are these changes going to affect us locally? And that's where local knowledge is really, really key to fill in the gaps that the data can't tell us. Here's a couple of graphs as well that I think are relevant. So I don't have the data for Cotswold District to hand. So this is some data I've been looking at for Cornwall that we've worked with the Met Office on. And what this is telling us is, for a particular part of Cornwall, what the best information we have at the moment for how the maximum temperature seasonally for that area is going to change over time. So we're really seeing an increase in both summer and winter of the maximum temperature. So this is telling us about the number of heat waves we're likely to see, which is going to have impacts on health, on how we travel. We can also look at things like rainfall. So again, this is telling us we're likely to see wetter winters and warmer summers. Again, impacts on health, on travel, also impacts on agriculture, how we grow our food. So we have this information. Again, it's not an exact science, but it's the best data we have, and we need to get better at using it. And that's something that has real relevance at a local level, and something that at the moment isn't coming out of events like COP. So we have to take that responsibility locally. I want to talk a little bit as well about, okay, so what does this mean for businesses? What are the incentives? And there's a couple of key points here. One is around measurement and disclosure. So this is effectively saying, what are you doing and what have you done? Are you measuring your emissions? What are your targets? How close are you getting to those? And what we're really seeing, and this was significant at COP, is a trend towards more and more businesses disclosing their carbon emissions, their footprint. This is just one graph that I found online from the New Climate Institute, showing more and more businesses starting to disclose their emissions. It doesn't matter what the numbers are. This trend is something we are seeing all over the place. And there's a few things to note here. One is that it's getting easier, but also that the businesses run the risk of being left behind if they're not doing this. This is going to become more important and more expected of businesses going forward. And some have already done a lot of great work on this, and some don't know where to start and don't necessarily have the support. So we have to think, okay, locally, do we have the capacity to support businesses to respond to this opportunity, but also this provocation, this challenge, this necessity? Is there the level of expertise and consultancy support available locally? Do we have the resources and the tools? And if not, how do we build that? How do we build the infrastructure where businesses can respond to this demand? On the other side of it, in terms of some real positive changes, is we're seeing a significant de-risking for businesses to invest in more sustainable activity. So all of the language that we talked about before around the toxicity of fossil fuels and the real commitments towards clean energy, changes in transportation, all of things that these are commitments that, while we don't know exactly how they're going to happen yet, significantly make it less risky for businesses to make these kind of commitments. Here's a quotation from McKinsey, a large consultancy firm, made just after COP, saying momentum has shifted towards net zero, providing businesses with a new organizing principle. And this is a really significant thing for such a large organization to say, effectively pointing out that, okay, this is now the dominant thing. This is now what businesses can commit to, can really lean into, put their resources there, because we know that this isn't going away anytime soon. This is it. This is the priority. It's still not necessarily completely easy for businesses to suddenly, start making those investments and those commitments, but it's getting easier. So again, thinking about where is the local leadership to support businesses to respond to this. And last specific point I want to make is around the sector-specific indicators, which is a bit of a tongue twister. So what I'm going to say here is just some of the examples of the specific plans or lack of plans that we're seeing in particular sectors. So firstly, I'm going to just briefly mention the Glasgow Breakthrough. So this is a set of not commitments, but plans or ambitions agreed at COP26 by 40 different countries, including the UK, the US, Australia, India, China, really looking at, okay, where do we want to be by 2030? So you can see here, it's looking at power, road transport, steel, hydrogen, and agriculture. And if you read these statements, you can see that there's not a really clear map of how we're going to get to those points, but this is a significant set of predictions, of plans, of indicators of where we are going. It's very unlikely that we're not going to see real trend and real shift towards these targets. Whether we meet them or not is a different question, but there is a significant shared commitment to work towards those. Looking more specifically at the UK's net zero strategy, where in some senses there's more detail and in some senses there's less, I've taken a few examples of some of the sectors that are echoed above. So thinking about agriculture for a minute, that we still don't have a clear and credible strategy for how we're going to address emissions from agriculture. Agriculture, of course, is a huge source of emissions, but also a huge potential carbon sink as well, if land is managed properly or sustainably, regeneratively. But we still don't have that strategy. So that's a big gap in our plans at the moment. Power, energy, you may well have heard about plans for decarbonisation by 2035, and there's a bit more clarity on okay, how is that actually going to be reached? Thinking about electrification and hydrogen. So again, doesn't necessarily mean these things are going to happen, but there's a clearer plan. And road transport, again, you might be more familiar with the plans to phase out fossil fuel cars, combustion engine cars, and vans by 2030. And again, there's a bit more clarity on how that's going to happen. So grants to support people to buy these, the infrastructure being improved. But there are still gaps in this. We don't know what's going to happen yet around HGVs, coaches, motorbikes, and other forms of transport. I'll share more details about these afterwards, but I think it's important to kind of note that in some places there are real kind of trends and directions of travel, and in some places we're still seeing a lot of gaps. So I'm going to wrap up in just a minute, but I kind of wanted to just summarize for me within all of this, and I've shared quite a lot of information here, what are the key points to take away that really affect us at a local level? And the first one is it's important that we focus on what has happened. Yes, it's not enough. It's not something that we should necessarily celebrate or feel hugely optimistic about, but stuff has happened and we need to hold on to that because we need to use it to accelerate forward. So take the advancements that have happened and use them to accelerate, because we absolutely need to move faster. But the good thing about acceleration is it doesn't have to happen in a linear way. It doesn't happen in a straight line. Acceleration can happen all at once. And this is another key point. So we're doing some research at the university about positive tipping points. So how the positive changes we need to see around energy, biodiversity, all sorts of behaviors and technologies can happen all of a sudden. You get the conditions right and change can happen quickly. So we need to look out for those opportunities as well and not get disheartened if it feels like things are moving slowly, because it might just be that those conditions are getting to the right point where change can happen very, very quickly. So this could mean about businesses. This could be about creating the conditions for businesses to be able to respond to the increasing incentives that we're going to see for low carbon behavior, for plans, for decarbonisation. There's a lot already out there. There's going to be even more. There's going to be more support for adaptation as well. And so our business is ready to respond when that change happens so that they can accelerate. We really need to focus on behavior change. There's some really interesting studies around behavior change suggesting that we only need a quarter of a particular community, a particular area to change their behavior for that to just completely shift across the whole space, the whole area. We don't need every single person to change their behavior, but if we're targeted, if we're focused, then we can create those opportunities for tipping points. That's something that is a really big priority. And then lastly on that, we need to identify these lines in the sand and keep them, not go behind them, and keep pushing them forward. So fossil fuels being a toxic asset, that's a line in the sand that we need to not go behind. So that's been said, that's not going to be unsaid, that's not going to change. So let's recognize that line in the sand and can then keep trying to push forward. So that's it. Look forwards, not look behind, and keep going in that direction. Thirdly, I mentioned adaptation. So it's really important that we keep doing mitigation, but also important that we really focus on adaptation, build that in a lot more, and really understand what resilience means. A lot of our language around our mitigation plans, our carbon neutral plans, use the language of control, how we're going to control our response to the climate emergency. But what climate adaptation tells us is we can't control everything. There are some things that are locked in. So how does our relationship with resilience change when we're not necessarily in control of everything that's happening around us? Because we do have the data to predict it, but we need to change what we do. Fourthly, certainly I see this a lot in working with academics. There's a lot of frustration with delay from a national perspective, and more academics are keen to work with people who are doing stuff on the ground now. Local councils, businesses, communities, all sorts of actors, and that's a huge resource. I don't just mean at the University of Exeter, any academic institution nationally, internationally. This is something that is, I think, more and more a really, really useful resource, whether it's climate modeling, whether it's social sciences, whether it's technology. We need to use those resources more and join up those dots. And then lastly, change is happening. I know there are quite a few people who felt pretty disappointed in that poll or quite despondent. Change is happening. It's not enough, but it is happening. And we need to act as though the next changes are already here, are inevitable, because they are inevitable. We just haven't quite got to the point where the political will, the behavior change has caught up with the technological capability or the scientific understanding. That these things are coming, and we need to act now as though they are already here, or though they are inevitable, and that will bring them closer and quicker. Because we are living in a post-COP world, a post-COP26 world, and that might not feel like it means anything right now, and it might not seem any different, but we will be able to look back at this and look at those markers in the same way that we live in a post-Paris COP15 world. And whether or not that means anything to you in practice, it's important to keep looking forward, see the changes that have happened, recognize those and build on them. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to Rachel to introduce the panel and take us further from there. If I've missed any questions in the chat, I'll respond to them in there. But thank you for your attention. And Rachel, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to get my screen share working. So yes, thank you. So we've got, I'm going to introduce Chris briefly, I thought first, but I may have misunderstood that. But never mind. We've got three speakers who've agreed to come along to speak today on a range of quite different topics. So Benjamin Dent will be speaking first, and he's a member of the Cotswold AOMB board and specialises in issues around land management, agri-environment, food policy, sustainable organic accreditation of land management and farming, and so on. So from a Cotswold point of view, this is obviously hugely important because agricultural emissions are one of our biggest emission sectors. So really excited to have Benjamin put that point of view across. He'll be followed by Claire. Claire Turner is a councillor from Blockley Parish Council, which is adjacent to Moulton in Marsh, where I represent. And Claire led the development of Blockley's climate emergency declaration, first of all, and then the action plan that the parish recently adopted that followed on from that, which is, I think, a really good example that other parishes can follow. And what I really like about it is obviously Blockley is your traditional, quite rural, quite sparsely populated parish. It's not a huge town, and I think it's a great example of how even relatively small communities can play a leadership role here. Following on from Claire, we'll hear from James, who's James Clark, Director of Marketing for 7Y Energy Agency. Some of you may well be aware that 7Y provide advice to both businesses and households right across Gloucestershire and also parts of Wales on improving domestic and business energy efficiency. And they run a whole load of schemes that have been around, I don't know, James will inform us, but I would say at least 30 years. And then finally, John Harris from the Gloucestershire Community Rail Partnership, broader interest in sustainable transport more widely, that hopefully will speak to some of those issues that Andrew raised about the problem really of how do we tackle emissions from transport in such a rural area. So without further ado, Benjamin up first, and I will put on mute, and I assume, Benjamin, you have the ability to share your screen. I've been made a co-host.
I would do, but I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to...
That's brilliant, then you don't need to. Thank you.
My life easier. I'm going to focus on two things. One is to talk about an initiative that's going on across the whole of the Cotswolds, which has been perfectly set up by Andrew's point just now, and then more generally about food and agriculture and the potential it has to tackle some aspects of climate change. So the Cotswolds is designated an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's one of 38 in England and Wales, and it's the largest area of outstanding natural beauty in the country, stretching from Bath in the southwest up to Banbury in the northeast, and obviously then therefore includes some of Cotswold District Council area. Cotswold National Landscape is the organisation which has the statutory duty to look after the Cotswolds, so to conserve and enhance its natural beauty, to promote the public understanding and enjoyment of the Cotswolds, and to foster local communities' economic and social well-being. And earlier this month, we launched our climate change commitment, which is our ambition to find a pathway to net zero or better by 2050 or sooner, in a way that respects the natural man-made beauty of this precious area. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to start by establishing a better evidence base, very similar to work that Cotswold District Council is already doing. We felt as an organisation we weren't that climate literate, so we need to know what are the current level of emissions across the Cotswolds, what are the options for how we're going to reduce that, what's the potential there, and also the potential for carbon sequestration and storage, where we can not just reduce our emissions, but actually extract some of the carbon from the atmosphere. Then we're going to put together all the different options for how that could work, and try and identify those which, as I say, respect the quality of this landscape, but also look at those wider aspects of what the landscape delivers. So that's biodiversity, food security, climate resilience, as Peter mentioned, and the way that that farming is going to have to adapt, and land management will have to change just because the climate is changing. Flood management, also a key part of what the landscape does for us. So we need to look at all those different combinations and find the optimum solution. And we'll do that talking to all our partners in district councils, to local communities, to farmers, land managers, and to businesses. So we're hoping to prepare that vision. And we just, actually yesterday, advertised for our net zero landscape officer. So tell your friends if you've got people who might be interested in that role. I think it's very exciting opportunity to take that landscape scale look at how we're going to meet these challenges of tackling climate change. I'm moving just quickly on to agriculture and food, specifically, as Peter said. It's responsible for globally about 30% of emissions. Agriculture in the UK alone is responsible for 10% of our emissions. And there are lots of different ways you can reduce it. You can use fertilizers more efficiently. You can improve soil husbandry, the storage and use of manure. You can use new technology. You can change the diets of livestock. So there are lots of different ways in which we can try and reduce that footprint. The drivers are quite important to understand. There is a shift in financial support for land management. So having left the EU, we're moving away from the Common Agricultural Policy to a new bespoke system of support for land managers, with the mantra of public money for public good. So our money for land managers who do things which benefit us as a society, which can be reducing carbon emissions, but also biodiversity, flood management, and services like that. So that is important, and that will change behaviour and decision making from farmers, but it is dwarfed by the amount of money that we all spend collectively on food. And actually those drivers of the decisions that we make every time we go shopping, and that businesses are making in how they source food is going to be, I think, a much more significant driver of change. One announcement that got a bit lost during COP, but was a commitment by 5 of our largest retailers, the Co-op, M&S, Sainsbury's, Tesco and Waitrose, that they are going to reduce the environmental impact of their supply chains by 50% by 2030 in a scheme that's going to be audited by WWF. So that's about, those retailers serve about half the population of the country. So that's going to be a major change, because suppliers of those retailers are going to have to change their practices to reduce their environmental impact, or they're not going to have a route to market. We're going to see a lot of other changes, I think, to land use as well, around issues of planting more trees, and we're going to want to look in the Cotswolds about how we do that in a way that, again, respects the character of the area, and opportunities for more renewable energy. And looking at ways in which, when I talk about landscape quality, we must also remember that, of course, the tourist industry is really critical to our local area, and that is a lot of the is about how our towns and villages look, and how the countryside appears, and that's very much a farmed landscape. So we need to consider the potential impact on visitors and to the tourist economy as well. And there will be other changes, as I mentioned, we're eating less red meat, and so farming will have to change through that as well. But one final thing I'd want to mention is what I think is really important is about food waste. Globally, all the emissions just from food that's wasted, there's more emissions than the entirety of Germany. If food waste was a country, it would be the 6th largest emitter of carbon in the world. And so it's a really important way that we can reduce emissions and then hopefully free up some land to do other things other than food production. In this country, we waste about 9.5 million tonnes a year across the whole of the supply chain. Now, that's an unimaginable amount. What on earth does that mean? That's 15 billion meals every year. That means you could feed the entire population of the country 3 meals a day for 11 weeks of every year through the food that we waste. So I think a real priority for the food industry and for farming is to see how we can improve our systems in a way that allows us to either to reduce waste or make better use of it. I think that's probably enough. What I would just encourage us as we go into the workshop phase is to think about these interreactions of the different parts of the system, because we don't want to look at sectors individually or actions individually, because there are a lot of interactions that we need to understand as we tackle these. I hope that's okay, Rachel.
That's great. Thank you, Benjamin. That I love those sort of facts like that bring it home, that make, hearing tonnages, billions of tons of this, it doesn't mean anything. But when you can put it in terms of this many meals for this many households for this many weeks, it suddenly looks like a ridiculous quantity of wasted food. So thank you for that. And I've put the link to your job in the chat bar. So if everybody can circulate that, that would be fantastic. Okay, so please do think about questions that you have for any of the panelists as they're speaking, because once all 4 have spoken, we'll have a panel session, a Q&A, where we can ask whatever, and we'll monitor the chat as well. So you can either put them in there or save them up and wave your hand when we come to that point. So I'll hand over now to Claire, who can unmute and put her video on, and she'll tell you what's happening in Blockley.
Hi there. I feel slightly fraudulent sat here because I'm not an expert in climate. I'm more activist than specialist, but I do lead on the climate and ecological actions for Blockley Parish Council. And Blockley is located in the north end of the Cotswold District, and we have about 2,000 residents. So as Rachel mentioned earlier, we are a kind of very small, relatively small parish council. And as Andrew touched on when he was putting his question earlier, we, like much of the Cotswolds, have car ownership that's much higher than the national average, limited access to public transport, and lots of older, energy inefficient properties that look beautiful as they are. So there's lots of challenges for us. Just over a year ago, Cotswold District Council were offering a workshop to support parishes and town councils to create action plans. And I attended as a member of the public at that time. and I left feeling motivated that there was a valuable role that parish councils could play, and that creating a plan would be a worthwhile thing. So I joined the council and I wrote a plan, and we adopted it in October, just gone. So although that took, I just want to add the point, that took me 12 months to get around to doing that. It doesn't take 12 months. So if there are any parish councils on the call who would like to make progress, don't be put off. It's not a 12-month process. It just took me that long. The Blockley Parish Council don't have control of lots of buildings or any significant portions of land. So there's not much opportunity for us to generate direct carbon reductions. So the plan is more about what we can do to help households and landowners and so on achieve those kind of reductions. The plan covers ecological actions as well as climate carbon actions, but there are 17 climate focused actions, and they broadly speaking fall into 4 categories. So there's a group of actions around embedding climate thinking into day-to-day decision making and our policies and so on. There's a large group of actions that are all about using our voice as a council. And so that's both our voice in terms of being a consultee and feeding information upwards, so supporting or criticising policies and strategies and so on, but also our voice directed to our parishioners. So there's an opportunity for us to amplify the messages that other organisations are putting out. And so that's I see that as a role around raising awareness, signposting to opportunities for people to take action, and also directing people to how they can input and influence policy decisions around where there's a carbon impact. The third group of actions relate to supporting community groups or landowners to achieve actions or activities that have a carbon benefit. And so that might be supporting a grant application to get funding to plant trees, or might be directly giving grants out at some point. We haven't had any applications of that nature yet, but there's the whole a group of actions that are about helping other people deliver what they want to do to get a carbon benefit or carbon reduction. And then the last group of the 4 is the more direct things that we're doing. And so there aren't so many of those because the opportunities are limited. But for example, we're exploring putting some EV charging points in the village hall car parks. And there are a small number of opportunities to plant hedgerows on the bits of land that we do manage. So those kind of things. And so we adopted the plan in October, so we're quite early in the process. But we have made some progress already. The electric vehicle charging points, we've just finished a public consultation, so I'm quite optimistic that we'll make some progress quickly now in the new year, towards the end of the year, this year into the new year. And we have a monthly meeting now. So the working group, the environmental working group, meet monthly, and we invite the public to come to every meeting. So interested members can join us and have their say, or make suggestions and contributions. And we met yesterday, in fact, and we invited local farmers along who gave us a lovely presentation about what they're doing, working in transitioning into a more regenerative farming approach. So they've recently got their organic certification, and one of the outcomes of that was that as a group, we are going to support them in January planting some trees. So they've got a grant to plant trees, and we are going to provide a bit of manpower from the interested working group that we have. So that's what we're doing, and that's where we're at. I'd be very happy to share what we've done so far and the template of our plan with other parish councils and town councils if it would be helpful to them. So I'm very open to sharing our learning so far. There's lots still to do, and I think it will be a very busy 12 months ahead trying to implement some of the things that we've agreed that we'll do. And I look forward to making progress on these areas. But I think it's interesting to hear Peter talking about behaviour change, because I think that's one of the things that we can really help deliver on, this idea of normalising those behaviours. And I love the phrase you used earlier about acting as though these changes are inevitable. And I think that's how we've approached this a little bit all along, that if we sell this idea that we've got to do these things, just, you know, what's the best way, how can we, as a community, we work together to do it, I think we can have a real impact. So I'm optimistic that other parish councils can do similar things, and whilst you may not have a direct carbon, you know, huge carbon impact, every little contribution will help. So please do get in touch if you'd like to know more about what we've done.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire. And yeah, I agree with that framing. It is, we are now at the sort of do or be done to stage in this whole progress. And you're absolutely right. It shouldn't be a case of people thinking, oh, we can't make a difference, because so much of this is about the parish council's role in normalising this in everyday conversation, that this is and absolutely should be the work of every level of government. And that makes citizens think that this is all normal and these conversations are things that we have, and you're not the weirdo if you stand there and ask about insulation or.
And Peter also mentioned the idea that you only need a quarter of people to change their behaviour, and then it has a life of its own. But that quarter of the people starts with one person. So I think that if there's just one person starting to take action, you will gather more, and it can make a difference.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on now to James. James is from 7Y Energy Agency, and he's going to talk to us about the work that they do across the Cotswolds and in providing support and advice, I guess, to households and businesses.
Thank you, Rachel. I don't know that I've been allowed to share my screen, but I want to buck a trend and I want to put a PowerPoint up. Is that possible?
I don't think I can help because I'm not a host of the meeting.
Oh, I can now. I can.
Can
now.
you? Well done. Okay,
right.
Great.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so as Rachel said earlier, some of you may know of 7Y anyway. We have been around a little bit of time. You've been overly generous, or maybe disgenerous to me, Rachel. I'm not as old as I look. We've been around 20 years, not 30, but it does feel like that some way. But we have been working with Cotswold District Council for that period of time as well, and we particularly work with Cotswold District Council to deliver some of their fuel poverty alleviation services and energy efficiency services to households here. So I'm going to be coming from a few different angles, and I'm going to be talking, obviously our primary angle is about energy efficiency. You don't need me to tell you how big a deal energy is when it comes to curbing our emissions and being able to reduce these impacts of climate change. It's a big deal. You also don't need me to perhaps show you graphs like this that you might be really familiar with. We tend to deal with the top three, I would say, at 7Y. We're trying to help people to act on their energy by avoiding emissions in general, reducing those that they can't avoid, and then making sure that they are making greener choices and substituting for decarbonised energy where they have to use those emissions or have to use that energy anyway. As an organisation, we work in a sort of what used to be called a energy agency model. It's where our name comes from. We tend to try and help everybody in the locality to take action on energy efficiency, to improve. Don't worry, you don't have to read all these words. I don't need you to do that. But effectively, I just want to communicate that we work across lots and lots of different sectors, and we work in partnership with lots of different sectors, and we try and meet people's needs in lots of different ways when it comes to sustainability. We are a charity, we are a non-profit company, and effectively I'm going to be coming from this from a local practical action angle. When strategies are made and when funding is allocated, we tend to be the people on the ground that physically make changes based on that strategy and based on that funding. And that means we have a privileged opportunity of being able to help people make significant carbon saving changes, but it also enables us to have insight because we get to see what it really means. You know, Rachel mentioned this in the chat a little bit earlier, the one size fits all doesn't work type of thing, and we get to see where that actually is a reality. So that's the sort of angle that I'm coming at today. And I'm also going to talk on two main subjects, one being how we help households become more energy efficient and what's in place there, and how we help businesses become more energy efficient and what's in place there. And bear in mind that 7Y don't necessarily work with the massive corporations, and we don't work with the multimillionaires as much as we work with the lower income households and the small businesses that are local here. So it's going to impact those people as well as the big boys. So just moving on briefly to what's in place when it comes to looking at the home retrofit challenge. Pardon me for the jargon. What I'm talking about here is making your properties more energy efficient by improving them, upgrading them, putting new technologies in, whether it's, as we've mentioned before, insulation, as you can see up on the screen, or whether it's on-site renewable energy generation, whether it's low carbon heating and all that sort of stuff. We have a partnership in place locally that Cotswold District Council are funders for, along with other local authorities in Gloucestershire and South Gloucestershire, called Warm and Well. It's been around for 20 years. And during that 20 years, we have been able to support tens of thousands of local people to improve the energy efficiency of their properties, either through behaviour change or through physically making changes to those properties. And a lot of the time that comes with funding that comes from various different places to help us improve properties and install energy saving improvements there. Often that funding has been channeled towards lower income households. And I'll show you a little slide in a minute that will prove to you that is an issue here in the Cotswold District as well as anywhere else as well. But it does leave gaps. So it does mean that we have questions that are still unanswered about how you help people in middle incomes or people, as we've mentioned a couple of times, Andrew brought it up, particularly in hard to treat properties. There's some real challenges there when it comes to household retrofit. The government is putting various regulations in place that guide the use of public funding in terms of home energy retrofit. And that's extremely good news. That means less botch jobs, less damp risk, let's just stick this on because it's doing something, but it's not the right thing. That's all great, but it does increase the cost of doing this. And again throughout COP26, we've been hearing everything comes down to who's going to pay for this. Where's the money going to come from? Yes, on a global scale, but also on a local scale. And I think that's one of the questions we've got to address, really. But it is massively on the uptick when we look at whether people within communities that we might consider, and this is a really crude phrase and I hate it, the able to pay customers, those that aren't in the lower income bands, those that aren't in danger of fuel poverty, which has always historically been our primary concern, but those who are motivated to want to make climate action happen now and climate change to start at home. And there has been an increasing amount of interest in that. We are doing many more surveys and assessments and roadmaps and decarbonisation plans for those who are able to contribute and are able to say, you know what, this is important enough. I'm going to put some money towards improving my home for the sake of the environment and climate action. There is also some interesting things coming out of central government. Obviously, Peter has mentioned the net zero carbon plan, but just earlier in the year, there was the sustainable warmth strategy came out. Now, this is related to fuel poverty in particular, so lower income households and how they are more energy efficient. However, there's been a distinct shift in that strategy from what has historically been lots and lots of funding going to fossil fuel technologies to improve properties and make them warmer and more energy efficient, to saying fossil fuels are no longer in our future. They're no longer in the plan for the future. And it's also a much closer link between those that are living in danger of fuel poverty, but because of their home being inefficient and energy inefficient. And so those two things together mean that just over the hill, we may be seeing significant changes in how we adapt properties and what technologies we use to adapt properties and where the funding is for those and where the priorities are. Just to give you a little insight in a moment around the, before I do that, I just wanted to name drop Cotswold District Council's Net Zero Carbon Toolkit. Maybe you've seen it, I hope you've seen it. Wonderful piece of work that basically lays out, it was produced earlier in, I think it was last year actually now, wasn't it? But it was produced in collaboration with the Forest of Dean as well, and lays out some really, really important principles based on how to affect retrofit in households. Here in the Cotswolds, we have a really interesting, well, I'm telling you what you probably already know, okay? If you look over the right-hand side, I'm going to see if I can use this. Can I use this? I don't know whether I can use this. But here on the right-hand side is the average fuel bill in the Cotswolds is massive compared to the rest of the county. It's neck and neck with the Forest of Dean in terms of how expensive it is to heat homes over here in the Cotswold District. And we need to consider that. We're 100% rural county as far as the gas network go, and we are topping the leaderboard for how much carbon emissions are delivered via the households that we've got here. I haven't used English well, but you know what I mean. In terms of the fuel poverty in the county as well, we have just below average fuel poverty, which you might expect, but it does mean that there is still 10% of our population struggle to pay their bills already, let alone given the changes to fuel prices that we're going to be seeing over this winter and over next winter. There's going to be significant challenges to how we make sure that a clean and fair energy transition happens locally here in the Cotswold District. We at 7Y have been able to put in measures that reduce some of the CO2 there, but this is a tiny amount. You know, we are, even with quite a decent chunk of funding from various different pots and quite a lot of creativity, we have still only been able to make small inroads into what are effectively really high carbon emissions. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm moving on from that part, just to very quickly say, here are the missing pieces and local challenges that I think we perceive when it comes to domestic retrofit, particularly domestic energy efficiency when we're relating to COP26. Current government funding plans and their approach to this is very much, let's throw £1 million at something over 3 months and we'll install one type of thing everywhere, just go and do it. It's a little bit at odds with their careful approach to the regulations that they have to observe, and it's a little bit at odds with a do things really well and get the right thing in the right place. It's also leaving places like the Cotswold District out in the cold a little bit, because it's taking a one-size-fits-all approach. It's saying, I mean, you will have heard the other week, the tiny bit of money that's coming available next year for heat pumps, that will, very few of those will fit nicely and neatly into Cotswold houses. So we have got some significant challenges there. We also have significant challenges in the industry. There just simply aren't the amount of green skills and green industry and infrastructure available to deliver on the aims that we've got at policy level. We are desperately trying to recruit at 7Y all the time for these technical skills, and there just isn't enough people out there that have these technical skills. Massive challenges there. And also, as Peter has said earlier, there is a huge challenge that we need to overcome when it comes to moving from just looking at how do we reduce our energy to how do we adapt to what is inevitably going to be huge climate changes that we are going to experience in greater or lesser part here as well. Very quickly, we also do the same sort of thing with businesses. And we run a program called Target 2030, which works with SMEs. We, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've offered £250,000 worth of grant funding towards businesses to help them save energy. And that's just within the Cotswold District, saving just 550 tons of carbon a year. Sorry, I haven't got a clever little equivalency there. But as you can see, that's only a very, very small amount of businesses. We emit 66,000 tonnes of carbon every year from Cotswold District businesses. So we've got a massive, massive chunk of businesses to work that we have to reach somehow. When we look at the map, the Cotswolds compared to the rest of the county, you can see how dispersed the businesses are that we're working with there. And that sort of metric Peter was on about, you know, you get a quarter of the community to engage in something, all of a sudden you change the cultural norms, you change the movement. Well, we've got some challenges here, I think, with how we create a business community that's coherent enough and together enough to do what we're talking about there. I'll skip through a bunch of slides about who is engaging, but effectively we are seeing a massive uptick in people's interest. You don't have to digest any of this. People's like businesses' interest in making carbon saving changes, especially in manufacturing, where actually there's a massive business incentive to save the money that comes with saving energy. And a lot of that is down to actually improving the second one down there, renewables, are third most popular grant funding application. And that is now probably in the last year, it's the number one. It's the one that we're changing the most. On-site generations booming. And so there's a lot to be hopeful about there, but there's a heck of a lot of work to do. So carbon footprint services and decarbonisation roadmaps are becoming an extremely important piece of the puzzle, as Peter showed with that graph of transparency when it comes to businesses looking to report and record their carbon emissions. We are seeing that time and time again, and we need to be able to factor in small businesses as well as large businesses there. Part of the issue is that looking at that net zero carbon plan, everything seems to be just over the rainbow. Like sometime in the future, there will be a carrot and a stick, and both of them will be working in tandem. But at the moment, neither seem to be very good. There aren't great incentives and there aren't great regulations. And I think we've got to be able to see that happening at policy level before we're going to see much happening in the business sector on the ground, because there is always going to have to be a business case for all of this. So I'm not going to go through my recurring themes because I'll run way over time, but there is lots of synergies between what has been coming out of COP26 and the policies and what we are seeing at a local level and some of the challenges that we have at a local level in order to see some actual change. And the important things I think here are making sure that we bring everybody along the journey and recognise the distinction of, and I suppose the special characteristics of Cotswold District, and the fact that it's rural, and the fact that it's got very old properties and heritage properties, and the fact that that one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. The local movement is absolutely key to seeing this this sort of action happen, even when it comes to the bare bones of things being about energy efficiency. Good old boring energy efficiency, but it is there. Thanks very much. Sorry to have run over a little bit there, Rachel.
That's right. That's very interesting. Thank you. I don't think energy efficiency is boring, but maybe I'm a bit weird. Okay, so our final speaker then, and James, if you could check the chat, because there's a couple of questions in there for you. So John, are you able to share? Do you need to share? But otherwise I'll hand straight over to John.
Thank you. Yes, if I could share the screen.
Is your share button available, or is it grayed out?
There you go. That should work for you.
Oh, there you go. It's done.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, just give me 1 second, everybody. Absolutely delighted to be with you today. These slides are going to be ready for reference after, so they can be shared to everyone on the call. Rachel, no problem at all. I'm just going to kind of bring things together, talking a little bit about Gloucestershire Community Rail Partnership and what we do. We do cover Cotswold District as well as the other district areas in Gloucestershire. And I'm just going to kind of pick up particularly on the behaviour change agenda that we've heard a lot about. So just so everyone's clear, the two key stations, railway stations that we are involved with are Morton in Marsh and Kemble, but we're not actually super interested in actually the railway station. What we're all interested in is communities that are served by the railway station. So as a community rail partnership, you can see what our overall aim is. It's a bit wordy, but you can see it's all around community engagement, giving a community voice to people that live and need to rely on public transport. So although we are a rail partnership, we do look an awful lot at walking, cycling, sustainable travel and bus use as well. That's in scope, not just simply working alongside the rail operators. So we've been going 18 months. We have formed as a community interest company, and there was a steering group. Hannah Fountain is on it, and Matt Britton was on it originally from Cotswold. These are the engagement areas that we're focused on. So county-wide destination management and tourism, and of course the AONB is a big part of that. Strategic planning and development, I'm going to pick up on that, and going down to a very hyper-local level in terms of what connectivity means locally and hyper-locally within a village or market town setting. So there's a number of tools that we've been developing alongside the LC-WIP, the walking, cycling and infrastructure planning that the county council's been doing, and I think Sarah Williams is on from the county. I've seen her in the list. We've been doing some community-led work looking at walking and what it feels like to walk. So this isn't a pure engineering audit, it's much more around placemaking and how people feel when they use certain spaces. And we are trying very much to involve youth and older people within these kinds of processes, not just those that are necessarily fit and able to access these routes. One of the things we've been able to do with the county is come up with a whole series of access maps which actually support walking and cycling, mainly walking and movement around some of our towns and cities. Now, Morton in Marsh, Kemble and Cirencester are actually next on the list for this year's programme, and we have funding to actually look at that. So this is a very immediate way that the Community Rail Partnership can kind of come in, work alongside community organisations, parish councils, town councils to try and co-create something like this. Another area which we have funding for is working with developers. We've made a very conscious decision that we want to target new development where the Section 106 agreement and the travel behaviour package perhaps doesn't go as far as we want it to. So yes, there are welcome packs for people moving in. Yes, there might be a taster ticket or a discount voucher for a bicycle, but actually, how does that translate to community cohesion? You could give away all of those things and not see a long-term behaviour change, and certainly not see behavioural integration where people are actually forming friendship networks and feeling a part of the community. This is particularly important where new estates are being built onto the edge of existing urban fabric, and those principles apply equally in a village setting as well as they do in an urban one. So this is hot off the press. This is an example of what we've done in Great Albury, which is not in Cotswold, but just over the boundary in Stroud District. And this is a comprehensive welcome map that shows how the development should integrate to blue infrastructure, employment areas, railway stations, and the public transport network. So this is the kind of thing that we're looking to try and do and support Cotswold in as we go into this year. We've also got a programme around station travel planning, and we very much based it on some work I did in the West Midlands called Stations and Places, which looks at railway stations as real hubs for the community and gateways. So there's a lot of social research that's gone into these particular perspectives. We look to do a similar process for the stations within Cotswold. Finally, we have a developer guide which we've produced, which is designed to help local parish councils and community organisations bring together all the evidence base about sustainable transport and present it back in the live planning applications and to the county in a very coherent way. And this developer guide is one of the first that's been produced, we think, by any community rail partnership in quite this way. So it's a bit of a groundbreaker as far as Gloucestershire is concerned. And there's a lot of guidance in here about how that low carbon dialogue can be articulated in a way that local people understand, but also that can be used with consultants and developers, agents, and the local authority. So there's a pile of information there. I can gladly send you this. Finally, we've been collecting evidence. We did a travel needs survey across the whole county during COVID, and also a major youth survey looking at the suppressed needs of young people, and that does include representation from Cotswold District. One of the final tools that we've done, and I've just got an example here, is that we're starting to deliver specific project work. So Brockworth, although that's over the boundary in Tewkesbury, have asked us to write their local sustainable travel plan for their village community. So it's actually a mini local transport plan just for their community. And this shows that you can take this kind of philosophy of behaviour change right the way down to a parish level. So if this resonates with anyone in Cotswold District, do get in touch with us. In the information pack, you can see the steps that we have gone through with Brockworth. Very similar thing could be applied to settlements within Cotswold District on the carbon model. These are some of the tools that we're using. We don't duplicate what the county or the district council would already do, or the AONB authority, but we would use other tools to complement that, and there's just some ideas there. That's my contact details, but hopefully that shows a little bit how the activities of the Community Rail Partnership can actually help with the low carbon agenda in Cotswold District.
Thank you very much, John. That's great. So we'll just, I understand you also have to nip off to another meeting soon, John. Is that right? Can you give me a nod? Yeah, I thought so. So just before you go, if I put the first question that came up for you, so that you can answer that one, and then if you have to nip off, it was that Andrew McLean, who's the ward councillor for the Risingtons, noted that Kingham Station is used a lot by Cotswold residents on that side of the district, and that was followed up by a comment about wanting to develop a greenway route on the former rail line from Kingham to Bourton-on-the-Water to link those communities. What's your view on the complications of that kind of cross-border working, where we tend to treat a statutory boundary as a sort of cliff edge, because it's problematic for the North Cotswolds when that happens?
I've got a good answer for you on that.
Excellent.
The good answer is that community rail partnerships can work across boundaries. In fact, we've been encouraged by the Stratford to Honeybourne Action Group and the Cotswold Line Promotion Group to get involved with Kingham Station. We know that the funding for the new developments in the Risingtons has nearly come to an end, but if the councillor wants to get in touch, we are looking for some test communities to look at what happens beyond that section 106. So we do have some funding where we could actually look at Kingham Station and what now needs to happen in terms of the Risingtons, and almost making a bit of a step change beyond what the section 106 could originally achieve. So if he wants to engage with us, we may be able to use that connection as a pilot project.
Great news, John. I'll be in touch.
Thought you might be.
That's it, John. You'll never get rid of him now. Okay, brilliant. All right then. So we're running a bit behind time. Thank you so much, John. I will just put one question each that came up to James and to Claire, and then we'll move on to the next session because we're running a bit behind. So James, very quickly, Fergus wanted to know how can they go about identifying households that are in fuel poverty in a community so that they can target activity there?
Can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me. Yeah, it's a tricky one, Fergus. It's a tricky one. And the reason for that is that, especially within the Cotswold District or in rural places in general, it's quite difficult to identify pockets of rural poverty. They are hidden. Rural poverty is different to urban poverty. There aren't ghettos in the old language. There aren't sort of diaspora, and there's not sort of areas where different communities of different demographics might congregate and live. So it's not quite so easy to say, well, that street has lots of people in fuel poverty, or that street might be at risk, or whatever. So it really is a matter of knowing, when it comes to rural poverty, it is being very, very embedded in your local communities, understanding who the people are, who the community leaders are in your local community, who are the people hearing the voices, especially in the rural Cotswold type community. There is no easy way, I'm afraid, of being able to say, here's a government map that shows that person at number 26 is in danger of fuel poverty and that person at number 28 isn't. There is some data around on EPCs and understanding the efficiency of people's properties, depending on whether they've been published, but it's quite a complex little metric, and sometimes those EPCs aren't published, depending on the tenancy and the occupancy of that particular home. So it's a really good question, Fergus. I wish I could give you a nice, easy answer. It would make my job a hell of a lot easier if I could find people in fuel poverty that easily. But it is really about having that local knowledge and connecting with local gatekeepers and knowledge keepers in the rural area. Yeah. So intent brief for you.
Thank you. Thank you, James.
Thanks, James.
There was, or just so that you know, the BRE Buildings Research Establishment were commissioned by the BEIS, the government, to develop a sort of a technical-based fuel poverty indicator that's very much looking at building standards. So you might want to make contact with the BRE, but that it's more about the poorer housing stock. It doesn't necessarily tell you the sort of socio-demographics of the people living in it, and it's a sort of interplay of the two that will tell you who's fuel poor, but that might be a good contact. And a final question for Claire, really, just to give some comfort to other parish councillors on here. Did you feel that this was, moving forward with a declaration and writing action plans, is this something you had to sell and you felt like you were the activist going in, or did it feel like releasing a dam of pent-up concern? Like, what's your advice for other people who feel like they might be the lone voice on a parish council wanting to achieve what you've done?
That's a really good question. I certainly wasn't the lone voice. There was definitely an interest and appetite to it, but not everybody was on board. So there was a certain amount of selling it, and certainly in the beginning. And I think this reflects some of the sort of comments earlier that Peter was making about how far we've come in this kind of journey. Even a year ago, there seemed to be much more resistance than at the point where we actually had a plan and we were asking people to adopt it. So I think, generally speaking, people are moving along that journey and realizing that actually, yes, this is our responsibility too, and we should do something. But it is doable, and it's small steps. So if you can't get every idea into the plan, don't worry. Some action is better than none.
Great, that's brilliant. So we'll wrap that up there then with the panel, and I'll hand back over to Peter now to explain the last part of the meeting.